Hear me?
Yes,
Yes. So I think so. All of you people practiced yesterday's session. Okay, Reena, did you get the recorded session to you? Reena?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So today we'll take the new concept called the constraints. Constraints is nothing but set of rules. As of now, we didn't write any rule on a column or a group of columns in a table. Just we created the table and we inserted the data so that we can able to insert the duplicates and null values. And when we inserted the rows for selected columns in an existing table, then rest of columns will be taking the null values automatically. Here null is a system unknown value, unsigned value, unavailability value. One null is not equivalent to another null, 0 is not equivalent to null value. So when we don't have any rule on a column or a group of columns in a table, then table allows any kind of information. It allows the duplicates, that means repeated data. The first time again the employee number is 100. The second time again I'm giving the 100 employee number. The whatever I'm repeating the employee number, that would be the duplicate. Right? And when we inserted the rows for selected columns, then rest of columns will be taking the null values. So this kind of the information I want to restrict. For those things here I am writing the rule on a column or a group of columns in a table. That set of rules is called as the constraints. Basically the table allows any kind of value. Basically the table allows any kind of value like duplicate data and the null values. When I am writing the rule on a column or a group of columns in a table, then the table will be restricted. Table will be avoiding the duplicates and null values. That set of rules is called as constraints. Set of rules is called as the constraints. The constraints are used to reduce the redundancy. Redundancy in the sense the repeated data, friends, or duplicate data. Integrity constraints are used to prevent invalid data entry into the table. Invalid data entry in the sense it may be a duplicate value, it may be a null value. So here we are having the two types of constraints. Here we are having the two types of the constraints. They are column level constraints and table level constraints. All column level constraints imposes on a column or a group of columns in a table. Friends, table level constraint imposes on two tables. What are the column level constraints is? Column level constraints are domain and entity integrity constraints. What are the domain integrity constraints? Domain integrity constraints is not null and check constraint. Entity integrity constraints is unique and primary key constraint. Unique and primary key constraint. The table level constraint is referential integrity constraint, that is a foreign key. Friends, here I am writing the rules on a column or a group of columns in a table to restricting the invalid data entry into the table. Invalid data entry in the sense it may be a duplicate value, it may be null value. Friends, so without having any rules, the table allows any kind of value. The table allows the duplicate data, repeated data, and null values. When we inserted the rows for selected columns, then rest of columns will be taking the null values, right? Now I want to restrict them. I want to prevent the duplicate data and null values into the table. So that here I am writing the rules on a column or a group of columns in a table. That set of rules is called as the constraints. Constraints are used to reduce the redundancy. Redundancy in the sense the repeated data or duplicate data. Here we are having the two types of constraints. They are column level constraints and table level constraints. Column level constraints imposes on a column or a group of columns in a table. Table level constraints imposes on the two tables. Column level constraints are domain integrity constraints and entity integrity constraints. Domain integrity constraints are not null and check constraint. Entity integrity constraints are unique and primary key constraint. Table level constraint is the referential integrity constraint, that is foreign key. Our target is to restricting the duplicate data and null values into the table. Now I am planning to restricting only the null values with the help of the not null constraint. Next, later on, so we'll see how to restricting the duplicates and null values both. First, I am trying to restricting the null values into the table with the help of the not null constraint. Hence, by default, table allows the null values when a not null constraint is enforced on a column or a group of columns, then table does not allow the null value. By default, table allows the null values when a not null constraint is enforced on a column or a group of columns, then table does not allow the null value. Here null is a system unknown value, unsigned value, unavailability value. One null is not equivalent to another null. 0 is not equivalent to null value. While creating the table itself, we can write the not null constraint on a column or a group of columns in a table. The not null constraint is one of the classification of the domain integrity constraint. Domain integrity constraint comes under the column level constraint. So here I can write the not null constraint on a column or a group of columns in a table. What are the columns having the not null constraint? Those columns does not allow the null value. While creating the table itself, we can write the not null constraint. Create table, table name, column definition 1, constraint, constraint name. Hence, it should be alphabet letter, constraint name, type of constraint, that is not null or check or unique or primary key constraint. Yes, column definition 2. So here constraint and constraint name is optional, but it is very difficult to drop a constraint without knowing the constraint name. To drop a constraint from an existing table, then here I am writing alter table, table name, drop constraint, constraint name. Right? So when we drop an entire table, then corresponding constraints also be dropped automatically. Right? So here I am writing the not null constraint on a column or a group of columns in a table to restricting the null values. What are the columns having the not null constraint in a table? Those columns only does not allow the null values. Right? So here I am writing create table name. Right? Employee number is the column name. Data type is integer. Constraint name is optional. Right? Constraint name, it should be alphabet letter. The type of constraint is here I am giving either not null or check or unique or primary key constraint. Right? So what are the columns having the not null constraint? Those columns does not allow the null values. Here I am writing the not null constraint on the column called employee number column. Is salary, the numeric of 6,2. Next, department number, integer. I am selecting the query and go for the execute. Now I am inserting the data. Insert into table name, then values, employee number 100, employee name, job, salary, department number. One row affected. I am trying to insert the duplicate null values for employee number column. It won't be inserted because employee number column having the rule that is called the not null constraint. Cannot insert the null value into the column called emp and o because the column does not allow the null values. Because here we have the not null constraint, right? For employee name column allows the null values because employee name column does not have any rule. So what I am saying that what are the columns having the rules? Those columns only does not allow the null values. What are the columns having the not null constraint in a on a column in a table? Those columns only does not allow the null values. Right? When we drop an entire table, then corresponding constraints also be dropped automatically. Right? Got it, everybody? The not null constraint. Right? So our target is to restricting the duplicate data and null values into the table. First, I am trying to restricting the null values into the table with the help of the not null constraint. I am writing the not null constraint on a column or a group of columns in a table. So that those columns does not allow the null value. While creating the table itself, here I am writing the not null constraint on a column or a group of columns. Those columns does not allow the null values. When we drop an entire table, then corresponding constraints also be dropped automatically. It's clear, Rina?
Yeah, Mahesh, a question. Can we enforce new constraints on an existing table?
On existing table, you should write the alter table syntax. So
Okay, so
if
we
you
can
want to,
add if you
yeah,
want.
add constraint name. I'll give the syntax. Okay.
Okay, and even we can, is it possible to drop a particular constraint?
Yes, alter table name, drop constraint name.
Okay, that's
Right.
fine.
Shruti, Uma is clear. Mahender.
Yeah, great.
Okay.
Put it on. Yes.
Yes. Now I'm going to write the check constraint. Here I'm writing the condition on a column or a group of columns in a table. While inserting the data to that particular column, then given condition should be satisfied. Then only the row will be inserted into the table. How I'm writing the condition. While creating the table itself, we can write the check constraint. Otherwise, if you want to write the check constraint for an existing table, then we can write the alter table syntax. Here I'm practicing the two syntaxes: create table, table name, column definition 1, constraint, constraint name, type of constraint of column name along with the condition, comma, column definition 2. If I won't write the check constraint for an existing table, then we can write the alter table, table name, add is the keyword, add constraint, constraint name, add constraint, constraint name, the type of constraint of column name along with the condition, column name along with the condition, without removing the constraint. So I want to disable the constraint. I want to disable all the functionality of the constraint. To enable or disable the constraint, here I am writing alter table, table name, enable or disable the constraint, constraint name. To remove the constraint from an existing table, to remove a constraint from an existing table, here I am writing alter table, table name, drop is the keyword, drop constraint, constraint name. When we drop an entire table, then corresponding constraints also be dropped automatically. Friends, so these are the syntaxes, these are the formats here I am having for the check constraint. I am writing the condition on a column or a group of columns in a table. So while inserting the data into that particular table, then given condition should be satisfied, then only the row will be inserted into the table, otherwise the check constraint will be violated. Here I am writing the create table syntax, create table, table name, the column definition 1, constraint, constraint name, type of constraint of column name along with the condition, comma, column definition 2. If I won't write the check constraint for an existing table, then we write alter table syntax. Alter table, table name, add constraint, constraint name, type of constraint of the column name along with the condition. Hence, to enable or disable the constraint, we use the alter table syntax. Alter table, table name, enable or disable the constraint, constraint name. To remove the constraint from an existing table, here I am writing alter table, table name, drop constraint, constraint name. When we drop an entire table, then corresponding constraints also be dropped automatically. Right? So now we'll practice the check constraint. So create table, table name, employee number. For employee number, I am giving the not null constraint. Constraint, constraint name is optional. Friends, next job, next salary, numeric of 6,2, constraint, constraint name, type of constraint of column name along with the condition, next div number integer. Here I'm executing, I'm selecting the current and execute. While inserting the data into the table, then condition should be satisfied. 1000 is less than 1000. Is it true? Salary is less than 1000. I have written here. I am trying to insert the data for the salary column, that is called 1000. The 1000 is less than 1000. Is it true? Condition is false. Simply trace the check constraint. While inserting the data into the table, then given condition should be satisfied. Then only row will be inserted into the table. 950 is less than 1000, so row will be inserted. We'll check the constraint details in the database, AnilDB database, the tables, emp_chk. There itself we have the constraints. check constraint. Just double click on the C1 constraint name which we have given. C1 constraint name is C1. The condition is criteria is salary is less than 1000, right? Salary is less than 1000, right? So now here I'm writing select star from CHK. I'm removing the constraint. So drop table, drop constraint, constraint name. I'm following the constraint name to remove the constraint. Without knowing the constraint name, it is not possible to remove the constraint. Friends, now I'm deleting the data because I want to change the condition on the same value, on the same column. Friends, now I'm going to write alter table, table name, add constraint, constraint name, type of constraint of salary is greater than 1500. So here I'm writing the condition is greater than 1500. If the already table having the 950, then constraint will be imposed. Hence, that's the reason we deleted the data here. Now I'm going to write the condition. Hence, when we drop an entire table, then corresponding constraints also be dropped automatically. These two are the not null constraint and check constraint. These two are comes under domain integrity constraints. Domain integrity constraint are the column level constraints. Basically here we do have the two types of the constraints. They are column level constraints and table level constraints. For all the column level constraints imposes on a column or a group of columns in a table, column level constraints are domain integrity constraints and entity integrity constraints. Here table level constraints imposes on the two tables. Table level constraint is the referential integrity constraint, that is a foreign key. Now I am trying to restricting the null values into the table with the help of the not null constraint. Friends, not null, when I am writing the not null constraint on a column or a group of columns in a table, those columns does not allow the null values. Even though if I am trying, our target is to restricting the duplicate data null values. I will show you. Friends, group of columns here are given, right? Employee number not null. Check constraint I given the salary. If you want to write the not null constraint, you can write for the employee name column, job column, right? Devout number column. You can write. Friends, so here I'm writing create table, table name, friends. So employee number not null constraint, constraint is optional. Friends, employee name not null, job not null, salary. Friends, numeric of 6,2 check constraint. Friends, next devout number not null. The same query here I'm explaining here. I'm executing. Right? Okay. Got it? Uma? Not null constraint and check constraint I have written on a column or a group of columns in a table. Right? Now I'm trying to restricting the duplicate data and null values into the table with the help of entity integrity constraints. Entity integrity constraints is also one of the column level constraints. Entity integrity constraints is unique and primary key constraint. Unique constraint which helps to prevent duplicate data into the table, but it allows the null values. When it is defined on more than one column in a table, then it's said to be a composite, the unique constraint, which having maximum number of columns is 16. Up to 16 columns we can write the unique constraint in a table. Those columns does not allow the duplicate data, but it allows the null values. Entity integrity constraints are unique and primary key constraint. Unique constraint helps to prevent the duplicate data into the table, but it allows the null values. When it is defined on more than one column in a table, then it's said to be a composite unique constraint which having the maximum number of columns is 16. Up to 16 columns we can write the unique constraint in a table. Hence those columns does not allow the duplicates, but it allows the null values. How I'm writing the unique constraint? Hence while create here itself we can practice the both syntaxes. So create table syntax and alter table syntax. Create table, table name, column definition 1, constraint, constraint name, type of constraint, comma, column definition 2. If I won't write the unique constraint for an existing table, then here I'm writing alter table, table name, alter table, table name, add constraint, constraint name, type of constraint of column name. Hence, to enable or disable constraint is alter table, table name, enable or disable constraint, constraint name. To drop a constraint, here I am writing alter table, table name, drop constraint, constraint name. Right? So when we drop an enter table, then corresponding constraints also be dropped automatically. Hence we'll practice the unique constraint. So create table, table name, employee number, constraint, constraint name, type of constraint is unique, employee name, job, salary, next devout number integer. Now I'm writing insert into table name, then values, employee number 100, employee name, job, salary and devout number. Again I'm repeating the employee number 100. Insert into table name, then 100, and 2020. Unique constraint violated, but it allows the null values. Hence we can write more than one unique constraint in a table. So here I'm writing alter table, table name, add constraint, constraint name u2, type of constraint of column name. Friends, so check this one. Right click on the tables and go for the refresh. So emp underscore u, two unique constraints are given, U1 and U2, right? U1 and U2, two constraints we have. It's two unique constraints. Now I'm removing one. Alter table name, drop constraint name. Up to 16 columns we can write the unique constraint like this, right? When we drop an entire table, then corresponding constraints also be dropped automatically, right? So unique constraint does not allow duplicate data, but it allows the null values. Unique constraint we can write for more than one column in a table. It's said to be a composite unique constraint. Right? Got it? About the unique constraint? You people, did you understand the unique constraint? To prevent the duplicate data into the table. It is also a column level constraint. What are the columns having the unique constraint? Those columns does not allow duplicate data, but it allows the null values, right? We can write the unique constraint using the create table syntax. We can write the unique constraint on more than one column in a table, right? Got it? Reena, Shruti, Uma, Mahender,
Yes.
right? Now we'll see primary key constraint. Primary key is nothing but unique plus not null constraint is a primary key. Unique and not null constraint is a primary key. Primary key does not allow both duplicates and null values into the table. Right? So here way of writing is same syntax. Primary key which helps to prevent duplicate data into the table. Right? So it is also a composite constraint, but a table can have only one primary key. Table can have only one primary key. Syntax is common. And here I am writing like this. Now here I am writing create table name, employee number, constraint name, type of constraint, comma, column definition 2. Next salary, numeric of 6, 2. Next default number integer. Next insert into table name, then values, employee number 100, employee name, job, salary, and default number. Next again I am trying to give the duplicate data for employee number column. Hence insert into table name, then values. It does not allow duplicate data. Right? It does not allow the null values also. It does not allow the null values. Hence, even though the table does not have more than one primary key, a table can have only one primary key. I am trying to add the primary key constraint on employee name column using the alter table syntax, showing that the EMP table already having primary key. Hence, it removes the previous key That is, a table can have only one primary key. It is also called as the parent key or candidate key. Friends, here I am dropping the table. If I won't write the primary key constraint on more than one column in a table, for the second column we can give the unique space not null constraint. Unique space not null constraint will be treated as a primary key. So create table name. So integer primary key I am giving. I am not giving the constraint name explicitly. When I am not giving the constraint name, system generates alphanumeric characters as a constraint name. Friends, in employee name, for employee name here I am giving the not null constraint. For job column here I am giving the not null constraint. For salary column I am giving, friends, the check constraint. Next, dev number not null. Friends, here the primary key is there. Constraints, unique check constraint. So here I am dropping the table. Here I am writing unique space not null constraint. Unique space not null constraint will be treated as a primary key. So it will be treated as a primary key. I am selecting the query and go for the execute. Now refresh. So when I am not giving the constraint name, system generates the alphanumeric characters as a constraint name. Isn't it? Friends, in the constraints also, check constraint. When we drop an entered table, then corresponding constraints also be dropped automatically. Whatever the constraints are there, all the data will be deleted, dropped. Right? These are all about column level constraints. Column level constraints are domain integrity constraints and entity integrity constraints. Domain integrity constraints are not null and check constraint. Unique constraints are imposes on the two tables. Unique constraints are quoting. Unique constraints are preventing the duplicate data, right? And primary key, both the unique plus not null constraint. So domain and entity integrity constraints are column level constraints. As of now, we have written the constraint on a column or a group of columns in a table to restricting the invalid data entry into the table. Invalid data entry in the sense it may be a duplicate value, it may be null value. Now, so once we practice this one, then how I am defining the relationship between the two tables. Hence, that we'll see later. Okay, tomorrow we do the session. Tomorrow we will have the session at same timing. Hence, tomorrow we'll complete the table level constraints and we'll start the joins concept. Okay, don't miss the session tomorrow. Okay.
Yeah.
Any doubts from the entity integrity constraints and domain integrity constraints? Everything is fine. Uma, Shruti, Reena, Mahinder.
Yeah, clear.
Right. So tomorrow we can do. Okay.
No doubts, Mahesh, but I'm unable to install this SQL server in my mission.
So you have to extract all the files after downloading and run the last file management studio 6NU GUNU 6GNU. Right?
Okay.
Okay.
What is that?
It was asking.
SQL Server Management Studio 64 GNU. Last one. After downloaded, extract all the RAR files. After extracting, select the run last one. Okay.
Okay.
Try to get the installation, okay, in your mission. And videos also in the YouTube videos also is there. How to install the SQL Server. Okay. See you tomorrow.